Dead America. Tales of the First Month. The Hiker. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 07:27 a.m. The first hints of sunlight began to emerge from behind the rolling hills in the picturesque mountains of North Carolina. While most of the world was just beginning to stir, nature photographer and avid hiker Connor was wide awake and in position in one of his favorite perches, providing him with the perfect view of the terrain. His career had taken him far and wide, clear around the world to places most people only got to see in pictures. However, every fall, he made his yearly pilgrimage back to the Appalachian Mountains to take in the beauty of the leaves changing color. The light misting of rain overnight helped to reflect the glow of the sky above, creating an awe-inspiring scene for him to capture. With a few clicks on his camera, the shutter snapped open and shut, providing him with exactly what he had come up here for. Now, if I can just convince a pack of birds to fly across the horizon, I'll be in business, Connor muttered to himself with a grin. The 30-year-old grinned ear to ear as the scene continued playing out before him. He sat there for a few more minutes, occasionally hitting the camera's release to capture the changing colors in the skies. After a while, the brilliant red and orange hues faded, making way for a bright blue. So what do you think? Head down into town and grab a little breakfast. Or hang out a little longer to see if any of God's creatures feel like being photographed this morning. Connor spoke aloud to himself, which was a common occurrence for him. The majority of his life was spent in solitude, either on remote shoots or traveling to those exotic locales. As he contemplated, a different idea struck him. It has been a while since I've checked in with Grant. He's going to be thrilled to hear what I've gotten so far. Connor reached into his bag, pulling out a mobile satellite phone. With the remoteness of his travels, it was a necessity if he wanted to stay in touch with the outside world, and the agent responsible for selling much of his work. With a few button presses, the line began ringing. After several moments, a weary voice spoke. "Do you have any idea how early in the morning it is, Connor?" Grant's voice was gruff, clearly sleep-deprived. "I'm up. The sun's up." "I thought you would be too," Connor replied. "I have 2 kids, including a newborn, both of whom are sick. I have a wife who hasn't slept in a week, which means I haven't slept in a week," Grant explained. "So you were up then?" Connor asked, a hint of humor in his voice. Grant paused for a long beat before responding in a gruff, agitated manner. "I was, but that's not the point, Connor. You very well could have caught me during the 30 minutes I sleep every night. I tell you what, let me make it up to you. Charlotte is only a few hours from where I am. Once I wrap up, I'll swing by there and bring you and the family a care package," Connor offered. "I don't know, Connor," Grant responded, his tone skeptical. "Come on, Grant. You've been my manager for the better part of a decade. I've picked up some gifts for the kids on my last trip overseas. I made a detour through Asheville on my way up here to hit that winery your wife loves. And I may or may not have some time to kill today to run down to Boone." "And what's in Boone?" Grant asked, sounding slightly intrigued. "Just this little distillery that makes legal moonshine. One of the locals at the breakfast place I go to let me have a taste. It's not exactly my thing, but I can say with confidence that it's definitely your thing," Connor explained. "Okay, yeah, it would be good to see you. Might give me an excuse to break away from the house for a few hours so we can talk business," Grant agreed, sounding less agitated. "You have some more assignments for me?" Connor asked, sensing an opportunity. "Something like that. An old business partner of mine started a travel website and needs some specific shots. I told him I would put you 2 in touch and you can see if it's something you're interested in." "Sounds good to me. If you want to set the call up for tomorrow evening, that will give me plenty of time to get there," Connor said. "You're not coming in tonight?" Grant asked, sounding surprised. "I don't think so. I'm pretty sure I got what I need already, but when I checked the weather yesterday, they were calling for a few inches of snow to fall overnight. I figure I'm already up here. Might as well get a little extra if I can," Connor explained. "Sounds good to me. If you don't mind Italian tomorrow, I'll make us a reservation at that little spot you like so we can talk some business," Grant offered. "Won't your wife be mad that you're leaving her at home with 2 sick kids?" Connor asked, raising an eyebrow. When you said you went to that winery in Asheville, how many bottles did you pick up for her? Grant countered. Half a case, Connor replied with a grin. Yeah, she'll be fine, Grant said, his tone lightening. Connor let out a laugh, which proved infectious to Grant, who quickly joined in. All right then. I'm going to head into town and grab some breakfast, then hit that spot up in Boone. I'll keep an eye on the weather up there and let you know if anything changes, Grant said. I appreciate it, Grant. If all goes to plan, I'll see you tomorrow. Before Grant could respond, one of his kids screeched in the background. Do me a favor. Enjoy the peace and quiet of the mountains for the both of us, Grant said with a hint of exhaustion in his voice. Consider it done. Good luck, Connor replied before hanging up. Grant muttered something as he hung up, prompting Connor to shake his head as he stashed the phone back in his bag. Yep, never having kids, Connor muttered to himself. He laughed quietly before grabbing his camera and carefully walking down the hill to his campsite. It was a modest setup with a small one-man tent and a camping stove. He stashed his camera gear inside before turning to head toward his truck. The path back to the road barely fit the definition of the word trail, as he was likely the first person in months to chart a course through the moderately thick underbrush. With the obvious lack of human traffic, he felt comfortable leaving his gear in place while he went into town. Not to mention the thought of lugging heavy camera equipment back down the mountain only to have to carry it up again caused his back to send a protest pain through his body. Yeah, I know. That's why I'm leaving it, he muttered. Connor rubbed his back as he walked, taking the better part of 15 minutes to reach the road and his truck parked on the side of it. With a quick turn of the key, the vehicle hummed to life, blowing out cold air at full blast. Nope, don't need that, he muttered, fumbling to turn the fan off. He rubbed his arms for a moment, getting the blood flowing before pulling out onto the road. The drive to the community of Sugar Grove was a relatively short one, only about 5 miles. The small winding roads added a bit to the travel time, but at this time in the morning they were clear of everything but the occasional small squirrel running around. A few minutes later, Connor pulled onto the main highway, driving half a mile up to the general store. This business was the true hub of the community, offering everything from gas to basic household goods to a full-service restaurant serving the best food in the region. Or at least that's what the sign out front said. Connor pulled his truck to the side of the building, throwing it into park and hopping out in a single motion. He walked up to the front entrance, taking note of the half-full parking lot as he went. Looks like everybody's trying to get an early start to the day. It's a good thing I don't have anything to do until sunset, he muttered to himself. Connor stepped through the front door, immediately greeted by the clattering of utensils on plates and a steady chatter coming from the restaurant in the back. He walked casually through the store, spotting a seat at the bar and heading that way. Before he reached it, a familiar voice rang out. I didn't expect to see you in here this early, Connor. I thought you'd be up on the mountain shooting your camera, Ruth called out. Connor looked behind the bar to spot Ruth smiling back at him. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail, allowing her youthful exuberance to shine through. Even though he had only been coming in for the last few days, she had taken a liking to him. While he hoped it was because of his winning personality, he knew it was most likely because he was the only person close to her age that came in and talked about anything other than farming. Good morning, Ruth. As fate would have it, I got my work for the day out of the way early. Now I get to engage in the best part of my job, Connor said with a smile. And what's that? Ruth asked. Hurry up and wait, Connor replied with a grin. Ruth thought about it for a moment, letting out a bit of a laugh once she realized what he was saying. I'm glad you have time to kill because it's going to take me a minute to get back to you. Let me drop off this ticket and I'll be right back, she said. I'm in no rush, so take your time. If you just want to drop some coffee off to me when you can, I can wait until it dies down to place my order, Connor said, leaning back in his seat. Ruth smiled at the photographer before running back to the window. She tossed the ticket into the opening, yelling out the order before darting over to the coffee maker. A few moments later, she dropped a cup off in front of Connor. I'll be back as soon as I can, she promised. Please, take your time, Connor said with a playful grin. The only thing I have on my schedule this morning is having breakfast and chatting with you. Connor gave the young waitress a playful wink, causing her to blush. The moment quickly passed as the cook repeatedly hit the bell, yelling out, "Come on, Ruthie, quit your flirting and get your ass in gear. Table 2 is up, and table 3 is right behind." Ruth tried to play it cool, offering up a slight smile, which devolved into cringing. "I'll be right back," she said, her tone tight. Connor chuckled to himself once her back was turned, not wanting Ruth to see how amused he was at her attempt to play it off. He added a little cream to his coffee, stirring it up before taking a long drink. "Oh yeah, that's the stuff," he sighed with relief. Before he could take another drink, a panicked scream cracked off from the front of the store. Connor, along with the handful of older farmers sitting in the restaurant, turned to see what the commotion was. It didn't take long for a young woman to run in through the front door, gripping a wound on her arm tightly, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Help me. Please, for the love of God, help me." Chapter 2. The terrified woman continued screaming as she ran into the store, heading straight for a stunned customer. The older man wrapped his arms around her as she approached him, instincts taking over his action. "You're okay. What's wrong?" he asked. Before the woman could respond, a blood-soaked zombie shoved its way through the front door. The ghoul let out a screeching moan, dropping a chunk of flesh from its mouth in the process. It only took it a brief moment to lock eyes with the customer, darting forward towards him at an alarming speed. The older man reacted swiftly, spinning around to protect the woman, but leaving himself open to the attack. Within seconds, the ghoul wrapped its arms around him, sinking its teeth into his shoulder. The rest of the people in the restaurant began to panic, watching their friend and neighbor's flesh be ripped from bone. His pained cries filled the air as he struggled to break free. "Son of a bitch," the customer yelled. The older man let go of the injured woman, giving him the ability to fight back. He lunged forward to break his shoulder free from the creature's teeth, immediately swinging his elbow backward. He made contact with the zombie's nose, generating enough force to snap the bone. Rather than stumble backward and react to the pain, the ghoul let out another moan and reached out for the customer's arm. Its bloody hands grabbed onto the man's arm, pulling him in close for another bite. The customer let out a panicked scream, struggling to hold the ghoul at bay as it closed the distance. The rest of the patrons watched helplessly as the zombie latched onto the man's throat. The zombie lurched its head back, ripping the man's Adam's apple out and sending a spurt of blood flying through the air. That scene was more than most of the people inside the store could handle, sending them scurrying towards the side exit. One man got up from his booth and rushed to the dying man's aid, pulling his handgun free, cocking the hammer back as he yelled, "Get the hell off my friend!" The armed customer shouted. The creature looked up as soon as the man's voice reached its ears. The ghoul let out an excited moan before leaping to its feet. The sudden movement forced the man to pull the trigger, sending a round straight through the center of the zombie's chest. The bullet was a through and through, doing absolutely nothing to slow it down. The customer fired off another shot, hitting the ghoul's center mass, having as much effect as throwing a marshmallow at it. Before he could fire off a third shot, the ghoul closed the gap, tackling the man to the ground. "Help me! Help me!" The armed customer screamed. Connor broke out of his fear-induced trance, leaping to his feet and rushing over towards the conflict. The man on the ground was fortunate enough to get his hands up to the creature's chest, holding it at bay. Connor approached from behind the zombie, reaching down and grabbing onto its thrashing arms. Within seconds, he had a firm grip on both of its wrists, pulling it off the terrified man. Rather than help his rescuer, he turned tail and ran out the side door. "Where in the hell are you going?" Connor yelled. Connor struggled for a moment, trying to keep the creature under control. He looked around for someone to help him, but everybody in the dining room had already fled. As hope began to fade, Ruth's voice pierced through the air. "Bring him this way," Ruth called. Connor turned to see Ruth standing in the kitchen doorway, waving him in her direction. He gripped onto the creature's wrists harder, making sure that it wasn't going to break away from him before moving. With a firm shove, he sent the zombie moving towards the swinging door. As they approached, Ruth retreated back into the kitchen, not wanting to risk being attacked by the ghoul. It took a few moments before Connor managed to push them through the entrance. "Where am I going?" Connor asked. "The freezer on the left," Ruth shouted. Connor looked down the wall, spotting a small walk-in freezer just up ahead. He let out a strained grunt as he continued pushing the creature forward, eventually getting it into position by the entrance. "I need you over here by the door," Connor instructed. Ruth knew exactly what needed to be done, rushing over and taking up a position by the freezer door. "Just shove him in and I'll lock it up," Ruth said. Connor nodded and prepared to execute the risky move. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Connor counted. Connor gave it everything he had, shoving the creature into the freezer with enough force to send the ghoul tumbling to the ground. Before it had a chance to get back to its feet, Ruth slammed the door shut, putting her full weight against it. A moment later, the ghoul inside sent the door moving as it smacked against it. "Get me the ice pick on the counter there," Ruth said. Ruth nodded towards a collection of kitchen instruments scattered on the nearby counter, prompting Connor to head over to it. It only took a moment for him to spot the ice pick, grabbing it and carefully sliding it into the locking mechanism on the door. Both of them inched back carefully, wanting to make sure that the door was going to hold. Once they were convinced, they relaxed, letting out a well-earned sigh of relief. "What in the hell is that guy's problem?" Connor asked. "Something has to be really wrong with him," Ruth said. "Yeah, no kidding," Connor replied. "I'm serious. He's a regular and one of the most mild-mannered people I've ever met," Ruth added. Connor looked over to the door, which was pulsating with every frenzied smack coming from the creature contained within. "Well, he's not mild-mannered anymore," Connor muttered. Both of their heads snapped to the left, drawn to panicked pleas for help coming from the dining room. Connor stepped back over to the table of kitchen utensils, grabbing a butcher's knife off of it before heading towards the kitchen door. Ruth followed suit, grabbing a knife of her own before falling into line behind him. The two of them moved swiftly to the door, looking out through the window before rushing headlong into danger. A couple had their backs against the wall, the man struggling to fight off another creature as it tried to take a chunk out of them. Connor didn't hesitate, pushing his way through the door and darting towards the confrontation. The man saw help coming from the side, extending his arms as much as he could to put some distance between himself and the attacking ghoul. Connor took notice, adjusting his course and raising the blade for attack. With a single forceful blow, he sent the blade straight through the ear canal of the creature. The impact had enough momentum to drive the knife into the zombie's brain all the way up to the handle. The ghoul convulsed for a brief moment before falling limp, collapsing to the ground as the man let it go. The four of them stood in stunned silence, looking down at the corpse. "Noah, are you and Lucy all right?" Ruth asked. "We're okay," Noah said. "Is Mark with you?" Ruth asked. "He's out at the car," Noah replied. As Connor stared at the defeated creature, recognition dawned on him. "Wait, is that the guy that was bitten a minute ago?" Connor asked. "What are you talking about?" Ruth asked. Connor used his foot to flip over the corpse, revealing the bite marks on its shoulder and throat. "I saw this man die not 2 minutes ago. How in the hell was he upright?" Connor asked. Before anybody could begin speculating, they were startled by a shotgun blast popping off from the front of the store. "We gotta help Mark," Noah shouted. The four of them rushed over to the front of the store as another shotgun blast went off. As they got into position, they heard the unmistakable sound of a siren approaching from up the road. Outside of the store by the pumps, they spotted Mark standing in the bed of his truck, aiming his shotgun at one of the zombies surrounding him and pulling the trigger. The creature's head exploded in a spectacular display of crimson and bone. "Christ, that cop is going to shoot your brother," Lucy shouted. Much to Noah's relief, the police car didn't stop short of his brother's truck. With a revving of the engine, the police car picked up speed and plowed through two zombies that were reaching up at Mark. The impact sent their bodies flying through the air, landing hard on the pavement. In a flash, Officer Stanton threw open the car door and darted outside, his gun already in hand. He took aim at the creatures he sent to the ground, opening fire as soon as he had them in his sights. With 2 trigger pulls, bullets ripped through their heads, ending the threat. Mark sent one more shotgun round through the head of the last standing creature, sending the corpse to the ground. "Mark, are you clear?" Officer Stanton asked. "Yeah, Stanton?" "I'm good," Mark replied. "Good. Grab your ammo and get your ass into the store. We need to lock this place down," Officer Stanton ordered. Mark complied with the order, grabbing a bag from the front of his truck as the two of them rushed inside. Ruth got beside the door, locking it up tight as soon as they were through. "Is there anybody else in here?" Officer Stanton asked. "Just one of those people locked up in the freezer," Ruth said. A flash of fear shot across the officer's face, but Ruth quickly put her hands up to calm him. "Don't worry, it's secure," Ruth reassured him. "Good," Officer Stanton replied. The officer's radio sent out a series of tones, which was quickly followed by a woman's voice. "Officer Stanton, do you copy?" Vicky asked. "Yeah, Vicky, I'm here," Officer Stanton replied. "What's your 20?" Vicky asked. "I'm down at the general store with a few other survivors." "We're about to lock it down," Officer Stanton said. "No can do, Stanton. I got a couple of fires to put out, and you're the only one I can get a hold of," Vicky said. Stanton let out a deep sigh, fighting the urge to turn off his radio and go into survival mode. After a moment, he clicked the radio back on. "Okay, what do you have for me?" Stanton asked. "I need you up at the Lancaster farm." "Mr. Lancaster called here with his hair on fire about his seasonal workers going crazy and attacking him," Vicky explained. "That sounds like more than I can handle. What's the other fire?" Stanton asked. "I've been trying to get Mrs. Dunlap on the line down at the RV park to give her a heads up about what's going on. I haven't been able to raise her," Vicky replied. Stanton looked over to the others, both Mark and Noah puffing their chests out and stepping up. "We've known the Lancasters all our lives, so we're happy to give you a hand if you want to head up there, Stanton," Noah said. Stanton nodded and clicked on his radio. "Hey, Vicky, tell Mr. Lancaster we're on the way," Stanton said. "Copy that," Vicky replied. Stanton turned to the brothers, nodding in appreciation. "Much obliged, Noah. But what about Mrs. Dunlap?" Officer Stanton asked. "I stayed there a few nights last year, so I know where it's at," Connor said. "And who are you?" Officer Stanton asked. "The name's Connor. I'm a nature photographer," Connor replied. "Nature photographer? Yeah, that'll come in handy today," Mark said with a scoff. Connor smirked and nodded back towards the creature with the knife sticking out of its head. "Why don't you ask your brother how handy I am?" Connor said. Mark looked over to Noah, who gave him a knowing nod, prompting his brother to let out a chuckle. "Well, my apologies," Mr. Mark said. "No harm, no foul," Connor replied. "I'll go with him, Stanton," Ruth said. "No, Ruth, I need you here getting this place ready to lock down. There's something bad going on out there and we're going to need a place to hold up," Officer Stanton ordered. "It's not going to take us 20 minutes to run down there and get back. Mrs. Dunlap knows me, so she's a lot more likely to believe this crazy story if I'm telling it," Ruth argued. Stanton thought about it for a moment before nodding in agreement. "Just don't take too long." "Ruth, do you have a radio?" Officer Stanton asked. "Yeah, I'll grab one out of the shop," Ruth replied. "Good, I'll be on channel 10. "Let me know when we're set up here," Officer Stanton said. "You got it, Stanton," Ruth replied. Ruth and Connor nodded to Stanton as he waved at the others to follow. "Come on, let's get a move on. There's a lot to get done, and I get the sense we don't have a lot of time to do it." Chapter 3. Connor sat in the passenger seat of Ruth's car, watching as Officer Stanton, led the caravan away to the Lancaster farm. He flinched as the driver's side door opened, a horrible squeaking sound filling the cab as Ruth jumped in. "Sorry, this girl is old and cranky, but she'll get us there," Ruth said. "I can drive if you want me to," Connor offered. "It's okay. We're just going a few miles up the road." Connor nodded as Ruth got situated behind the wheel, turning the key and giving her older sedan a few moments to warm up. Once the engine purred, she threw it into drive and hit the gas, moving at a deliberate pace down the winding mountain road. "So how long have you been at the general store?" Connor asked. Ruth let out a chuckle, shaking her head and causing a bit of confusion in Connor. "I didn't realize that was a funny question," Connor said. "It's just small talk? With everything that's going on?" Ruth replied. "I figured speculating isn't going to do us much good, but clearing our heads might," Connor said. "Fair enough," Ruth said. "So how long have you been there?" Connor asked. "It's a family business, so I guess my whole life," Ruth answered. "Really? So you never moved away?" Connor asked. "I went to college in Boone, so just a few hours away. So technically I moved away, but I was home every other weekend, so it didn't really feel like it," Ruth said. "So what brought you back for good?" Connor asked. "My mom, she got diagnosed with cancer during my senior year," Ruth said. "I'm sorry to hear that," Connor replied. "It was rough there for a couple of years, but it eventually went into remission. But it woke something up inside my mother, made her feel her own mortality," Ruth explained. "After what we just went through, I can relate," Connor said. Ruth let out a laugh as she continued. "Yeah, no kidding. But for my mom, it meant that she wanted to do the things she never got to do over the years. At the top of her list was seeing the country. So her and my dad took a chunk of their retirement money, bought a camper, and headed west." "So how did that end with you coming back to the store?" Connor asked. "My older brother lives down in Texas with his family and career, and being fresh out of college, I was the logical choice to look after things while they were gone," Ruth explained. "They started out on a 6-month trip, which stretched into a year, and are currently approaching the 2nd anniversary." "And you were okay with that?" Connor asked. "I guess so. I mean, it's my home, so there's a certain level of comfort to being here. Plus, after they told me they were going to spend another year on the road, I had them change their will to give me the house and business," Ruth said. Connor let out a chuckle, nodding in agreement. "If I could have put my dreams on hold for a couple of years and gotten a house out of the deal, I think I would have jumped at that offer," Connor said. "I majored in business, so it felt good to get some use out of my degree negotiating that deal," Ruth replied. Both of them laughed briefly before falling quiet as they approached the turnoff for the campground. Their attitudes flipped like a switch, going from carefree to locked into the moment. "I want you to be ready to throw it into reverse at the first sign of trouble," Connor said. "With this driveway, I'm going to have to turn around. But don't worry, if it looks bad, then we're out of here," Ruth replied. Connor nodded and kept his head on a swivel as Ruth made the turn. The driveway was long and winding, with a steep drop-off on either side, leading down to the dense forest below. After nearly half a mile of driving, they reached an open area filled with a couple dozen camping vehicles. Ruth parked along the edge of the road, just off the driveway and right in front of a double-wide trailer that acted as the main office. She cut the engine, leaving the keys in the ignition as they looked around for trouble. There were no signs of life anywhere in the campground, just a collection of campers and the vehicles that brought them there. "Shouldn't people be up and about by now?" Connor asked. "It's not even 9 yet. If they had one of their late-night bonfires, there's a good chance everybody in here is sleeping one off," Ruth replied. "Let's hope that's what it is. Come on, let's get up to the office," Connor said. Both of them stepped out of the car, shutting the doors as quietly as they could before heading toward the front of the trailer. While there was a small sign signaling it was the office, it was difficult to spot due to a collection of flowers and wall decorations adorning the wall and door. "I'm guessing this is Mrs. Dunlap's place?" Connor asked. "Yeah, she does. Must be nice to get to work from home," Ruth replied. The two of them walked up to the door, Connor giving it a light rap with his knuckles. They waited several moments, not getting a response. He took a deep breath, looking behind them toward the rows of campers, hesitant to make more noise but ultimately giving in. He gave another solid knock, waiting patiently but still getting no response. He glanced back at Ruth with concern, putting her on edge in the process. Connor raised his hand up, gesturing for her to hang on as he leaned over the railing to get a look through the front window. His eyes went wide when he saw the disastrous state of the living room. "Something's not right. It looks like someone ransacked the front room," Connor said. "She was never much of a housekeeper," Ruth replied. "This looks like more than that," Connor said. "Come on, let's look around back. I'm pretty sure there's a big patio door we can get a better look through," Ruth suggested. Connor nodded and followed the young waitress around to the back of the trailer. Both of them paused for a few moments beside the door, poking their heads around cautiously in case someone or something was on the other side. The kitchen was in worse shape than the front room. The kitchen table flipped over onto its side and chairs strewn about. On the floor sat a puddle of blood, with matching streaks on the wall. "Did she have a husband?" Connor asked. "I don't think so, but if they were drinking at the bonfire last night, there's no telling who she brought home," Ruth replied. "Well, there's a mental image I didn't need," Connor said. Connor reached down and grabbed onto the door handle, giving it a light pull, opening it right up. Ruth glared at him, bewildered by the action. "There's blood, and she might be hurt," Connor explained. "Or she could really be hurt and turned into one of those things like back at the store," Ruth interrupted. "You got your knife, don't you?" Connor asked. "Yeah, but I'm not exactly in a hurry to use it," Ruth replied. "Don't worry, just a quick look around. Then we'll grab the guest book and start calling the people camping here to let them know what's happening," Connor said. Ruth thought about it for a moment before giving a half-hearted nod of approval. "Yeah, I guess that's safer than going door to door," Ruth agreed. Connor nodded as if he wasn't fully convinced of his own plan. Regardless, he pressed on, sliding the door open wide enough for the two of them to get inside. No sooner had they secured the patio door than footsteps began pounding on the cheap laminate flooring. Connor raised his knife into a defensive position just as a zombified older woman came running into the kitchen, blood running down the front of her face and nightgown, as if she had enjoyed a fresh meal recently. Connor kept the blade at head height as she rushed him, watching in amazement as the zombie ran directly into it. The tip of the blade pierced her eye, embedding fully in her head, draining the life from her corpse in a matter of seconds. The two of them stared at her lifeless body, shaking their heads at the quick encounter. "Well, I think it's safe to say whatever this is doing to people, it's taking whatever intelligence they have," Connor said. "Did she just really run straight into your knife?" Ruth asked. "Yep," Connor replied. Both of them jumped at the sound of frantic banging coming from down the hallway. Connor reached down, yanking his blade free from her head before getting into an attacking position. The two of them moved carefully through the trailer, honing in on the source of the noise at the far end of the hallway. Blood trailed the entire way, staining the floor and walls, as if an injured person had rushed through there. They stopped a few feet shy of the door, which was shaking under the barrage of fists from the other side. Connor took a deep breath before speaking loudly. "Can you understand me?" Connor asked. The response came in the form of agitated moaning and the smacking of hands against the door. "I'll take that as a no," Connor said. He gave it a quick look over, seeing that despite the assault the zombie was giving it, the door was holding firm. "Come on, let's get that guest book and start calling people." "I don't want to be here any longer than we have to be," Connor said. The two of them moved quickly to the front part of the trailer, looking around the ransacked area for the guest book. It took a couple of minutes of looking before Ruth found it underneath an overturned table. "I got it," Ruth exclaimed. Connor grabbed the table, setting it upright so they had a place to work. She opened the guest book to the newest page, spotting a long list of names and numbers. "You want to start at the bottom and I'll start at the top?" Ruth asked. "And we'll meet in the middle." "Let's do it," Connor said. Before either of them could pull out their phones to dial, several gunshots popped off outside. The duo rushed to the front window, looking out to see what all the commotion was about. Three people fought their way from the camper to a pickup truck as a handful of zombies rushed toward them. Two of them had handguns, opening fire on the encroaching mob, but doing little to slow them down. The front edge of the pack slammed into one of the men at the back of the group, quickly enveloping him into their ranks. The other two people turned and sprinted the rest of the way to the vehicle, barely getting inside as the zombies converged around it. The driver slammed on the gas, the back tires spinning in the dirt before gaining traction. They sped toward the driveway, moving a lot faster than they should have, losing control of the truck. The front of the vehicle slammed into the side of Ruth's car, sending the deafening sound of scraping metal through the air. The truck had too much momentum for the car to absorb, sending both vehicles skidding along the ground. The duo watched helplessly as her car went over the edge, rolling down the steep incline to the trees below. The truck managed to hang on for a few moments, teetering back and forth before ultimately succumbing to gravity and joining the sedan at the bottom of the gorge. Connor let out a deep sigh before taking a seat in a nearby recliner. Well, so much for a quick trip. Chapter 4. Connor and Ruth sat side by side on the sofa, both of them nursing cups of coffee and prepackaged pastries. Despite the tasty nature of their treats, their faces bore no expression other than a sense of defeat and boredom. The television in the corner of the room bathed the space in warm, artificial light, however. The only thing on screen was an empty news studio. The words "We'll be right back" ran across the bottom of the screen on an endless loop. Outside, the sounds of moaning continued to fill the air, occasionally broken up by the sound of screaming. Ruth broke the silence. "How long have we been sitting here?" Connor replied, "A couple of hours, maybe." While they kept their voices low, it was more than enough to agitate the creature down the hall, prompting it to begin slamming its hands against the door again. This set off a chain reaction, drawing the attention of the handful of ghouls just outside the trailer. A moment later, the front door and windows of the structure were under assault by the undead. "That's getting real old," Ruth muttered. Connor sighed. You would think, with all the screaming coming from the other campers, that they would have wandered off by now. "They're like old bloodhounds," Ruth replied. "Once they have your scent, they don't want to let it go." "Did a lot of hunting, did you?" "I'm a country girl," Ruth said. "Getting my first kill was a bigger deal than my sweet 16 or prom night." "I can believe it." "Really? Most people who weren't born here think I'm making it up." "I've traveled the world taking photos. Trust me when I say that there are far more unconventional coming-of-age traditions out there." Ruth smiled. "If we survive this, you'll have to share some of them with me." Connor grinned. "You got yourself a deal." He playfully extended his hand for a shake, and Ruth reciprocated before reaching down for the radio in her bag. She tuned it to channel 10, clicking it on and speaking wearily into it, as if she already knew what the response would be. "Officer Stanton, it's Ruth. Do you copy?" Nothing but silence came back over the line. "Come on, Stanton, you can't ignore me forever," she muttered. She held the radio to her ear for the better part of a minute, silently praying that his voice would come through. After giving up hope, she tossed it to the side, picking up another prepackaged treat and tearing into it. "Can I get another one of those?" Connor asked. Ruth held the pastry in her mouth as she reached into the box, grabbed another one, and tossed it over. The two of them sat there in relative silence for a few more moments, savoring every bite. "So what do you want to do?" Ruth finally asked. "We checked the pantry," Connor said, "and it looks like Mrs. Dunlap died with a lengthy grocery shopping list because there wasn't much in there. So we're going to have to find food sooner rather than later. I got plenty of food back up at the store. And I think I know how we can get there." "You do? How?" "It's taken me a little while to get my bearings, but I swear there's a trail not too far from here." "I don't know of any trail near here. Are you sure?" "About 80% sure." "You want to risk our lives on 80%? It's 80% out there, but close to 0% in here with no food." "Yeah, you got a point. So where is it?" "It's to the south of here, can't be more than a quarter mile. The last time I was here, I went out exploring, slid down the hill in the back, and stumbled across it. I don't know if it was an old hiking trail or hunter's path or what. All I know is it took me to this gorgeous overlook north of here. Got some great shots if memory serves. But does it go all the way to the store? I don't know, but it was a bit overgrown when I took it, so there shouldn't be anybody out there, and that's a win in my book. Okay, I'm in. Should we tell the others? Connor thought about it for a moment, ultimately shaking his head. The ones who are left here didn't sound all that interested in leaving. If they want to believe help is coming, who am I to tell them otherwise? But if there's nobody in Boone to do the news, and the national networks haven't cut in, then we have to assume this isn't just happening here. And some backwater, zero stoplight community isn't exactly high up on the priority rescue list. Exactly. So we have to act like we're on our own. Ruth nodded as the duo finished the rest of their makeshift breakfast. Once complete, they stood up, stretching out their tired muscles in preparation to escape. Connor stepped over to the corner of the front room, where Mrs. Dunlap had a small umbrella stand. He reached in, rummaging around for a moment before pulling out a wooden baseball bat. "How did you know that was hiding there?" Ruth asked. "The last time I was here, she had a rude customer and pulled it out. Thought it couldn't hurt to see if it was still here." "You got a hell of a memory there, Connor." "Let's just hope the part about the trail is right." Ruth chuckled as she shook her head, doing everything in her power to put any sense of doubt out of her mind. Connor stepped over to the front window, looking out at the carnage that had overtaken the RV park. A couple dozen creatures were spread out over the expanse, most of them converged around a handful of campers at the far end of the lot. 4 ghouls remained vigilant outside their trailer, not wanting to let go of the survivors inside. "Move as quietly as you can to the back door," Connor instructed. Ruth nodded as the two of them tiptoed through the trailer, minimizing the sound of their footfalls on the floor. Both of them took a knee beside the patio door, looking outside at the empty space just beyond. Grass stretched on for 20 yards before dropping off the side, leading down to the trees below. Connor angled his head, trying to get a look to the south, but he wasn't able to see much due to the glare coming from the sun. "Damn this low-hanging sun," he muttered. "Great for sunsets, but terrible the rest of the time it's up." "What if we just go straight back?" Ruth suggested. "This place is up on a bit of a plateau, so it should circle around, right?" "Makes sense to me." "I'm game if you are. I like trying that better than running across an open field we can't see." "Same here. Just watch yourself when you get to the drop-off, it's going to be steep." "I've slid down my share of embankments. You just watch your ass." Ruth gave Connor a playful wink, trying to remain confident even though she was terrified. "Okay," Connor said, "I'm going to lead us out. Step softly over the patio bricks, then pick up the pace once we're to the grass. You watch to the right, I'll take the left. If any of those things spot us, haul ass." "Let's do it." The two of them rose to their feet, gripping their weapons tightly as Connor reached out for the sliding glass door. With a light pull, he freed it from its frame, moving it as gently as he could to minimize the noise. Despite this, a light squeaking sound reverberated through the air. Connor glanced back at Ruth, both of them wincing at the sound and realizing they needed to move quickly. Rather than take it cautiously on the patio pavers, they hit the ground running, knowing their cover was already blown. By the time their feet hit the grass, they heard moaning coming from both sides of the trailer. Half a dozen creatures emerged from cover, immediately locking onto them and sprinting in their direction. The duo pumped their legs hard, focused entirely on the drop-off that was rapidly approaching. As they got within a few feet of the edge, they both slid to the ground like someone trying to steal second. "Oh shit," Connor yelled. Connor's eyes went wide as he laid eyes on the steepness of the drop-off, which looked to be at a 70-degree angle. Both of them picked up speed as they slid, gravity working firmly against them. As the duo rocketed down towards the trees below, they looked back towards the half-dozen creatures in pursuit. Unlike them, the creatures weren't prepared for the sudden drop-off. 2 of them tumbled forward almost immediately, slamming headfirst into the ground and snapping their necks. The other 4 lost their balance, landing on their sides or flipping head over heels down the hill. Without the semi-controlled descent the sliding provided, the creatures picked up a lot of speed, closing the gap quickly. "Look out," Connor shouted. Connor rolled to his left as best he could while descending, narrowly avoiding a zombie as it tumbled by. He looked over to Ruth, who covered her head as two creatures flew by her at alarming speeds, barely missing her. Connor readied his bat as he reached the bottom, leaping up and running towards Ruth, who was trapped between two ghouls that were struggling to get back to their feet. He came up behind the first one, swinging the bat across his body and connecting with the side of the creature's head, caving it in. "We have to move," Connor shouted. He kept himself in a batter's stance, staring down the zombie on the other side of his partner, waiting for it to make a move towards them. Much to his relief, the creature's leg snapped in two as it pulled itself off the ground, only to collapse back down in a heap. "Connor," Ruth shouted. Ruth's panicked tone forced him to spin around, catching a glimpse of another creature sprinting towards them. He swung the bat in an awkward manner, barely connecting with the zombie's shoulder. The impact was enough to send it falling to the ground, landing face first in the dirt. Ruth pounced, driving the tip of her knife into the back of its head, ending its threat. "Are you okay?" Connor asked. Ruth planted her foot on the back of the zombie's neck, getting just enough leverage to yank the blade free. "Yeah, I'm okay. Are you?" "Yeah, but that's definitely a ride I don't want to get on again." The two of them looked back up the incline, spotting the three other zombies as they continued sliding down. Only one showed any signs of life, flailing about as it continued to fall due to multiple broken limbs. "Come on, let's go find that trail." Chapter 5. Several hours passed as Connor and Ruth made their way up the heavily overgrown trail. Despite the remoteness of their location, Connor's satellite phone provided them with a GPS, giving them a rough idea of where they were. He pulled the device out, powered it up, and did a quick check. Ruth sighed and looked over at him. "Please tell me we're getting close to the store. I'm a fan of the outdoors, but we're quickly approaching my limit." Connor pulled up the GPS app on his phone, giving it a moment to dial in. Before too long, a small blue dot plopped down on the map, just shy of the highway that ran by the store. He held the screen up so that she could see. "Oh, thank God," Ruth said. "It looks like we're going to be coming out near the bottom of the hill just up from the store." Connor grinned. "After our last hill, it'll be nice to climb one for a change." "This one isn't all that steep, plus it's paved," Ruth added. The duo continued walking along the makeshift path, stopping when they reached a clearing close to the road. Ruth got her bearings, looking around before pointing to the north. "And my store should be right over that." She trailed off as she spotted a plume of black smoke rising in the distance. Connor continued walking, stopping only when he noticed she stopped talking. "What's wrong, Ruth?" he asked, turning to face her. Connor turned to see his partner staring into the distance, tears forming in her eyes. He rushed back and looked in the same direction she was, quickly spotting the smoke. "Maybe it's not your store," he suggested. "It could be a car." "That's a lot of smoke," Ruth said, her voice trembling. "All the more reason to get there quickly." "Come on." Connor reached down, grabbing her by the hand and pulling her along. The duo picked up the pace, ignoring their strained muscles as they raced toward the road. It didn't take long for them to reach the asphalt, make the turn, and ascend to the top of the hill. Ruth's focus remained on the plume of thick black smoke, her dread growing with every step. Connor, however, kept his focus on the road ahead, gripping his baseball bat tightly in case of unwanted company. "Oh my God," Ruth breathed. She darted forward at the first sight of her general store, instinct taking over as she saw that the smoke was pouring out from the kitchen area. The only thing she wanted to do was get to her family's livelihood, but she was prevented from doing so by Connor. With a firm grip on her wrist, he dragged her behind some trees at the side of the road. "What are you doing?" Ruth asked, panic rising in her voice. "I have to get there and put out that fire." "Look at the front of the store," Connor said, his voice low. Ruth adjusted her view, letting out a gasp as she saw a small horde of zombies scattered about. A couple of them were trying to get in through the front door, but nearly a dozen were surrounding Connor's pickup truck at the side of the building. "Why are there so many of them around the truck?" Ruth asked, her voice shaky. I wish I knew, Connor replied, his eyes fixed on the mob. It's mine, so I can safely say that I didn't leave anything of interest in there. Both of them stared at the truck, reacting with gasps as a young woman stood up in the bed, looking around for any signs of help. Despite the distance, they could tell that she was upset and injured. We have to help her, Connor said. How? Ruth said, a note of disbelief in her voice. Those people are everywhere. And no offense, but I don't think you're good enough with that baseball bat to take them all down. Connor gave her a subtle nod, knowing she was right. He then adjusted his focus to the zombie mob surrounding the truck, trying to figure out any sort of solution. After several moments, inspiration struck him. Do you still have your phone on you? He asked. Yeah, why? Connor reached into his bag, pulling out the satellite phone and powering it on. I need you to put your number into my phone. Ruth let out a light chuckle as she took the phone from him. What's so funny? Connor asked. You've been eating every meal in the diner since you've been here, she said, a playful smile crossing her face, and chatting me up the entire time. I was wondering when you were going to get around to asking me for my number. Connor joined in with her amusement, blushing ever so slightly. What can I say? He replied, shrugging. I'm a little shy at times. Ruth smiled as she punched in her phone number, saving it and handing the device back to Connor. Okay, now I need your phone. She gave him a strange look as she complied with the request. What do you have in mind? She asked, confused. Connor didn't respond. Instead, he looked around the ground for a moment before picking up a handful of rocks that weighed roughly the same as the phone. Your case is strong, right? He asked. Yeah, Ruth said. Strongest one on the market. I've dropped that thing more times than I can count, and it's still working just fine. Good to know. What are you going to do? Ruth asked, her curiosity piqued. Connor pointed out towards the store, his finger aiming straight for some bushes at the corner of the lot. I'm going to move up there, get the range dialed in with the rocks, then throw the phone into the truck bed. Ruth gave him a curious look, as if he were speaking a foreign language. What good is that going to do? She asked. The parking lot is on a bit of an incline, Connor explained. So I'm going to tell her to get into the cab and put it into neutral. With any luck, she can roll away from them and down to us. That's not much of a plan, Connor, Ruth said. I'm open to other ideas, Connor said, because at the moment it's either this or leave her behind. Ruth contemplated for a moment before reluctantly giving in to the plan. Just be careful, she said. Connor nodded and turned to walk away, only to have Ruth grab his arm and pull him back in. She put her other hand on the back of his head, planting her lips firmly on his. A few seconds went by before she released her grip. Sorry, she said. I've wanted to do that for a couple of days now. I really should have asked for your number earlier, Connor said, a grin tugging at his lips. Yes, you should have. Now get moving. Connor nodded and broke from cover, staying low as he darted across the street. Ruth watched as he slid to the ground behind the bushes, giving him a thumbs up to let him know that none of the zombies by the store had spotted him. Connor carefully poked his head above the top of the bushes, holding onto one of the rocks tightly. His truck was a good 20 yards from his position, slightly uphill. Okay, you got this, man. Just put your whole shoulder into it and let it fly. Just don't forget to duck down once you let it go. Connor let out a grunt as he popped up, letting the rock fly and ducking back down in a single motion. He looked through the bush, quickly honing in on the rock as it found a landing spot 5 yards shy of the truck. He held his breath, hoping that the rock clattering on the ground didn't draw the attention of any nearby ghouls. One of the creatures looked around for a moment before quickly turning back to the mob. Stop holding back, Connor urged himself. Let it fly. He grabbed another rock, leaping up and throwing it as hard as he could. He watched it soar through the air, letting out a smile as he heard it clang against his truck. Sorry, girl, he said, a rueful tone in his voice. If we live through this, I'll get you a new paint job. Connor focused his attention on the truck, watching as the young woman stood up and looked around in confusion. He grabbed the phone, readying it for flight. "You got one chance," he muttered to himself. "Don't screw it up." Connor lightly tossed the phone in the air a few times, getting a feel for the weight. After a couple of deep breaths to steady himself, he jumped up from behind cover and let the phone fly with everything he had. He retreated to cover, watching as the device flew through the air. Much to his surprise and relief, his aim was true, resulting in a satisfying metallic pinging sound as it landed in the bed of the truck. Connor turned back to Ruth, waiting for her to give him the thumbs up that it was safe to retreat back to her position. Once she gave the signal, he broke away from the bushes, running hard across the street and taking cover behind the trees. "It sounded like you made the throw," Ruth said. Connor reached into his bag, pulling out the satellite phone and hitting dial. "One way to find out," he said. He held the phone horizontally so that both of them could listen. After the first ring, the device connected, and the voice of a scared and confused young woman came through. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Brandy's voice trembled. "We hear you." "Are you okay?" Connor asked. "Not really. One of those people bit me, and a lot more of them want to," Brandy replied. Her voice trembled with fear as she spoke, causing Ruth to speak up in a soothing manner. "You're going to be okay. I'm Ruth, and my friend here is Connor. Now, what's your name?" Ruth said gently. "It's Brandy," she answered. "Okay, Brandy. My friend here has a plan to get you out of there, so I'm going to let him talk now. Just trust him, and you're going to be all right," Ruth reassured her. "Okay, Ruth. I can do that," Brandy said. "Brandy, I need you to get into the cab of the truck," Connor instructed. "The window on the back is unlocked, so just pull it open and slide through." "Give me just a minute," Brandy replied. The duo watched the young woman struggle with the window before ultimately getting it open and sliding through. They could hear her jostling around before she spoke again. "Okay, I'm in the driver's seat. Where are the keys?" Brandy asked. "They're in my pocket, but you don't need keys," Connor replied. "I don't know how to hotwire a truck," Brandy said, sounding uncertain. "You don't need to. All you have to do is put the truck into neutral and release the parking brake," Connor instructed. "How is that going to help?" Brandy asked, still confused. "I just need you to trust me, Brandy. Keep your hands on the steering wheel and keep it as straight as you can once it starts rolling backwards. Aim for the bushes at the corner of the lot and let it keep rolling onto the road. Once the tires hit the asphalt, you slam on those brakes and let us get in," Connor explained. There was a long pause on the line, as if Brandy was trying to mentally convince herself that she could pull off the risky maneuver. Finally, she spoke again. "I can do it. But those things are going to be following me," she said. "It's okay. We only need a second to jump into the back," Connor assured her. "Let me know when you're ready," Brandy said. "We're ready when you are," Connor replied. Brandy looked at the steering wheel, letting out a deep breath as she gripped it tightly. "Here we go," she murmured. She reached down to the gear shift and threw it into reverse before releasing the parking brake. Within seconds, the truck began rolling backward, gently pushing the zombies at the rear out of the way. The truck quickly picked up speed as it rolled down the hill. Brandy struggled to keep the vehicle heading in the right direction, but managed to hit her mark. The truck plowed through the bushes, bouncing over the edge of the lot and onto the road. Brandy slammed both feet into the brake pedal, bringing the vehicle to an abrupt stop several yards away from Connor and Ruth. "Move. Move," Connor shouted. He grabbed Ruth by the hand, pulling her out from cover as the two of them sprinted toward the truck. The zombies ran hard down the hill, a few of them tripping up as they went, picking up too much speed to stay upright. This bought them just enough time to reach the truck bed, leaping up and inside just before the ghouls arrived. "Stay in the middle of the bed until we're clear," Connor instructed. Ruth nodded as Connor pulled himself up, reaching through the window with the keys in hand as the ghouls grasped at him. "Start the truck and get us out of here," Connor shouted. Brandy reached over, grabbing the keys and slamming them into the ignition. As soon as the engine fired to life, she threw the truck into gear and hit the gas, speeding them down the street. Connor looked back at the mob of ghouls in pursuit, getting further and further away with each passing second. "Where am I going?" Brandy asked. "Get a mile up the road and pull off so we can get in the cab," Connor instructed. "I can do that. Hang tight," Brandy replied. Connor took a seat against the back of the truck, pulling Ruth up and wrapping his arm around her. The two of them looked back at the smoke plume, which continued to grow in size. "I'm sorry about your store," Connor said. "It's okay. At least there's a silver lining," Ruth replied. "And what's that?" Connor asked. "I don't have a job to go to, so I can travel around with you for a bit," Ruth said with a faint smile. Connor let out a laugh before kissing her on the top of the head. He kept her pulled in tight as they drove down the road to safety. Chapter 6. Brandy drove the group a few miles down the road, eventually finding a small pull-off area meant for travelers who wanted to get a good look at the scenery. She stopped in the middle of the empty lot, cut off the truck, and sat in the driver's seat, sobbing. Connor leapt over the side of the truck bed, reaching his hand up and helping Ruth down to the ground. Both of them could hear Brandy crying, forcing them to approach the driver's side window cautiously. Ruth reached out and knocked gently to get her attention. "Are you all right, Brandy?" Ruth asked. The young woman opened the door, stepped out, and immediately fell into Ruth's arms, bawling her eyes out. She tried to speak but only managed a string of incomprehensible sounds. "I think I have a med kit behind the seats," Connor said. "I'll dig it out if you want to take her to the tailgate." Ruth led the distraught young woman to the back of the truck, laying the tailgate down and ushering her up. They both got into a comfortable seated position, sitting in silence for a few moments before Connor arrived with the med kit. "It's pretty basic, but I should be able to patch up that arm for you," Connor said. "What's the point?" Brandy asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm just going to become one of those things." "We don't know that, Brandy," Ruth said. "I know what I've seen," Brandy whispered, her voice shaky. Connor looked over to Ruth, giving her a forceful nod to get her to continue talking to Brandy, knowing it would be easier to treat the wound if she was focused on something else. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Ruth asked. Brandy sobbed for a few more moments before nodding and beginning to speak coherently again. "My friends and I were at the dorms in Boone, shooting the shit before classes when one of those things showed up," Brandy said, her voice trembling. "It's a bit of a blur, but someone yelled out as they were tackled to the ground. We just thought it was a fight, at least until it took a bite out of them." Brandy winced in pain as Connor applied some peroxide to the wound. "Sorry, I know that stung, but it's necessary," Connor said. Brandy took a deep breath before nodding for him to continue treating the injury. "So, what happened next?" Ruth asked. "A lot happened," Brandy said, her voice hollow. "Most of it I don't want to remember, but a carload of us managed to escape the city and get to that store where you found me. I thought we were safe until my friends who had nasty bites woke up from their naps. Within seconds, they went from the nicest people you'd ever meet to attacking us. The next thing I know, this one is throwing rocks at me." Brandy let out a grunt as Connor tightened the bandage around her arm. She looked down at the wound, seeing a hint of red soaking through the white fabric. "That should do for now, at least until we can find you something more significant," Connor said. "Thank you," Brandy replied. "It's the least we can do," Connor said. "So now what? Is there someplace safe we can go?" Brandy asked. "That's definitely a Ruth question," Connor said. "The only spot I know is out in the woods, and even though it's remote, I don't think any of us want to be sleeping under the stars tonight." "I can try Stanton again, see if they have the farm secured," Ruth said. "What about going to your place?" Brandy asked. "It's in one of the few neighborhoods up here, and I really don't want to be around people," Ruth said. "How far away is that farm?" Connor asked. Ruth looked around, trying to get her bearings before responding. "Can't be more than 5-6 miles, Ruth said. "The turnoff is just up ahead, I think." "Let's start heading that way," Connor said. "You can try and get the officer on the radio while we go." You drive, I'll navigate, Ruth said. Does that sound all right to you, Brandy? Connor asked. I'm in no position to complain, Brandy said. I'm just along for the ride. Let's get moving then, Connor said. The trio spent the next 15 minutes in relative silence as they slowly moved down the road. The light sound of static filled the cab, emanating from the radio in Ruth's hand. The only thing breaking up the monotony was her occasionally calling out for Officer Stanton. Connor made the turn into the driveway of the farm, stopping a few yards off the road. What do you think? Should we go check out the house? Connor asked. We're already here, so we might as well, Ruth said. But you can't reach your officer friend on the radio, Brandy pointed out. There's 1,000 reasons why he might not be answering, Ruth said. And a few of those scare the hell out of me, Connor muttered. We don't have to get out of the truck, Ruth said. If we get close to the house and things don't look good, we can back up and head somewhere else. Connor and Brandy exchanged a concerned look, prompting Ruth to speak up more forcefully. The Lancasters are good people, and at this point in the year, they're going to have a ton of food stocked away ready to be shipped out, Ruth said. So, unless you want to try and clear out a grocery store, this might be our best bet to eat tonight. The other two held a silent conversation with one another before nodding in agreement. Okay, we'll head up, but keep your seatbelt on because the ride may get bumpy, Connor said. The two women checked the security of their safety belts as Connor slowly pulled the vehicle forward. They inched down the long and winding driveway before the two-story farmhouse came into view. All three survivors muttered in disbelief to themselves at the sight of 24 bodies scattered about on the ground just outside of the house. Connor stopped the truck at the far edge of them, 30 yards from the house, giving them a chance to inspect the battlefield. My God, what happened here? Brandy whispered. Whatever it wasn't good, Connor said. I don't see any movement on my side, but I can't see the boarding house from here, Ruth said. Boarding house? Brandy asked. For the seasonal workers, Ruth explained. There isn't much in the way of hotels in this area, so they have bunks set up for them at the far end of the property. Judging by their clothes, I'd say that's who those bodies belong to, Connor said. Ruth focused her attention on the corpses, noting that most of them were wearing durable and dirty jeans and work shirts. A few of them, however, stood out for a different reason. Oh my God, Ruth murmured. Ruth threw open the door and ran toward a few bodies that were close to the house. Connor quickly followed, grabbing the bat out of the back of the truck. Ruth raced up to the corpses, taking a knee beside them, fighting the urge to break down. What is it, Ruth? Connor asked. Do you recognize them? Ruth asked. Connor had his head on a swivel, looking for trouble, only looking down when he felt it was safe to do so. While he couldn't remember their names, he immediately recognized them from the general store from earlier in the day. It's the guy with the shotgun and his brother, isn't it? Connor asked. Mark and Noah, and his wife Lucy, Ruth said. Look at them, there. Ruth trailed off as she stared at the mangled bodies, all of them having multiple bite marks and missing huge chunks of their heads. Do you see Stanton out here? Connor asked. Both of them looked at the sea of bodies, giving them a once-over in search of the officer. After a quick sweep, they realized he wasn't there. I don't see him, Ruth said. Me either, Connor said. Connor turned to the house, seeing that the front door was ajar ever so slightly. I want you to go get Ruth from the truck and get ready to come inside, Connor said. What are you going to do? Ruth asked. I'm going to make sure there's nobody inside, Connor said. Connor brandished his baseball bat, putting on his bravest face before walking toward the front door. He paused at the entrance, gently pushing it open and stepping through. The carnage wasn't limited to the outdoors, as several bodies littered the entryway of the house. Connor stepped over them carefully while looking around and listening intently for any noise. Several pieces of furniture were overturned, including a heavy table that was just to the side of the front door, as if it had been used recently as a blockade. Blood painted the walls red, appearing to be from multiple contributors. Connor made his way to the staircase, stopping at the base and looking into the two large rooms on either side. The signs of battle were less prevalent than in the front room, but it was clear that something bad had taken place. Connor flinched when he heard footsteps coming from the second floor, honing in on them as they moved from the back of the house toward the top of the stairs, the floorboards creaking under the pressure. He stood fast at the base of the stairs, looking up and preparing to run if he needed to. The footsteps continued moving slowly across the second floor, getting closer to the landing above. Connor lowered his guard a bit once he saw the police uniform on the figure on the second floor, only to tense up when he saw he wasn't moving all that well. "Officer Stanton?" Chapter 7. Connor continued gripping his bat tightly as he stared at the uniformed figure standing above him. His first call-out resulted in no verbal response, putting him on edge. "Officer Stanton, is that you?" Connor asked. "How do you know my name?" Officer Stanton replied, his voice shaky and broken, as if he were suffering from severe shock. Connor quickly realized it and softened his tone while pulling his bat behind him. "My name's Connor. We met at Ruth's general store a few hours ago," he explained. "I'm the one who went with her down to check on Mrs. Dunlap. Do you remember?" Connor, "Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not great with names. Especially today," Officer Stanton admitted. "It's understandable, officer. Why don't you come on downstairs?" Connor suggested. Stanton hesitated for a few seconds before beginning his descent down the stairs, and Connor immediately understood why the officer was in shock. His uniform was in tatters, several pieces torn away at the fringes. The front of it was covered almost entirely in blood, which extended to his hands and face as well. "Jesus Christ, officer, are you okay?" Connor asked. There was a lot of unpleasantness, Officer Stanton said, his voice low and strained. "As soon as we left the vehicles, they were on us. Mark barely got a shot off before he was." He stopped halfway down the staircase, leaning back and falling into a seated position, as if he were experiencing the incident again. "It's okay. You don't have to talk about it," Connor reassured him. "The important thing is that you're safe." "Am I, though?" Officer Stanton asked, his voice a whisper. "Yes, you're safe," Officer Connor replied firmly. "Ruth is with me, and we have another survivor as well." "Mrs. Dunlap?" Officer Stanton asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry, but she's gone," Connor said. "We found a college student when we got back to the general store." "We'll bring them inside so we can lock this place down," Officer Stanton urged. "There may be more of those people out there." Connor turned his head back toward the front door, calling out, "Ruth, you and Brandy can come in. We're clear." A few seconds later, Ruth pushed the door open, leading Brandy inside the house. They stepped over the corpses and over to Connor, pausing as Officer Stanton came into view. "Hey, Stanton, are you okay?" Ruth asked. "Yeah, he's okay, just in a bit of shock from everything," Connor explained. "Why don't you take Brandy into the bathroom and see if you can find something a little more substantial for her arm?" "What's wrong with her arm?" Officer Stanton asked, his tone rising with authority. "It's nothing," Connor replied quickly. "She just hurt it at the general store." Stanton's voice raised along with him as he stood up from his seated position. He put his hand on his handgun that was holstered on his hip, taking a couple more steps down to get a better view of the young woman. "You're going to answer me right now," Officer Stanton demanded. The authoritative tone sent a chill down Connor's spine. He gripped his baseball bat tightly, which was still out of sight of the officer. He turned his head slightly to the side, able to make side-eye contact with Ruth, who had frozen in place. "Answer me right now, or else I'm going to assume she was bitten," Officer Stanton warned, his eyes narrowing. Ruth reached back, grabbing Brandy by the arm and holding her in place. Connor stood his ground as Stanton continued walking down the stairs, stopping a few steps from the bottom. "Stanton, I'm going to need you to calm down," Connor said firmly. "I am calm," Officer Stanton retorted. "I've seen what those bites do to people, and I'm not going through that again." Connor pulled his bat out so that Stanton could see it, causing the officer to chuckle a bit as he stepped down to the ground level. "Really, son?" Officer Stanton scoffed. "I'm an officer of the law, and you're going to threaten me when I'm trying to help you?" "We're leaving right now," Connor said, his voice cold. "Go back upstairs and nobody gets hurt." "I don't like the tone in your voice," Officer Stanton growled. "And I'll be damned if I'm going to let a young punk like you tell me how to do my job." Connor looked down, spotting Stanton attempting to draw his handgun from his holster. Without hesitation, he darted forward to prevent him from doing so while yelling out, "Ruth, get back to the truck." Connor managed to grab onto Stanton's wrist just as he cleared his holster, holding the weapon toward the ground. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure the girls had cleared the house before escalating the fight. "You're in a lot of trouble. I hope you realize that," Officer Stanton warned. "Yeah, kind of the way my day's been going," Connor muttered. Stanton reached up with his offhand, grabbing Connor by the throat and pushing him back. However, the grip on his firearm was unbroken. The officer drove his attacker backwards several steps before Connor managed to plant his feet against one of the fallen creatures for stability. Connor didn't waste the opportunity, driving the top part of the bat into the side of Stanton's ankle. While it wasn't forceful enough to cause a break, the impact was painful enough to force the officer to let go. With his newfound freedom, Connor forcefully pushed Stanton off of him, sending the officer tumbling back to the ground, opening up a chance to escape. He turned and sprinted to the front door of the house as Stanton drew his handgun, firing off a single shot that narrowly missed, embedding in the doorframe as Connor plowed through it. The officer let out a string of curses under his breath as he leapt to his feet, moving swiftly to the front door with his weapon in hand. He threw open the screen door, stepping onto the front porch and spotting Ruth behind the wheel of the truck. "You're not running from me," Officer Stanton yelled. Stanton raised his gun toward the truck, but before he could fire, Connor's baseball bat made contact with his wrist. The violent impact shattered the bones in the officer's wrist, causing him to drop the gun to the porch. "All you had to do was let us go," Connor shouted. Connor raised his bat up for another strike, only to pause when the truck horn blared. He turned for a brief second, spotting Ruth shaking her head no. Clarity struck him in that moment, realizing that she was right. Stanton wasn't a bad guy, he was just experiencing a traumatic episode. "Good luck to you, officer," Connor said quietly. Connor stepped over to the handgun, kicking it off the front porch before walking toward the truck. He barely got halfway to it before Ruth laid on the horn again, prompting him to turn around. Stanton was on the ground in front of the porch, rummaging around for his handgun. Connor broke into a sprint, getting to the back of the truck just as the first shot went off behind him. He couldn't see where it hit as he dove into the bed of the truck, only that it didn't hit him. "Go, go, go," Connor shouted. Connor smacked the side of the truck several times, getting Ruth to hit the gas. A split second later, they were backing up rapidly as more gunshots went off from the front of the house. Connor could hear a couple of them bounce off the front frame of the truck, but the third one hit pay dirt. One of the front tires exploded as the bullet pierced through it, causing the truck to swerve violently to the side. Ruth managed to regain control of the truck just long enough to get them driving straight in the other direction. However, she couldn't keep it on the driveway for long. The vehicle careened off the path before coming to an abrupt stop against a tree. The damage to the engine caused the horn to blare uninterrupted. Connor popped his head out from the bed of the truck, looking back toward the house, expecting to see Stanton in pursuit as more shots went off. Much to his relief, the officer's focus wasn't on them. Instead, it was on the handful of creatures coming down the road from the bunkhouses. "I'll take the help wherever I can get it," Connor muttered. Connor pulled himself up, leaping over the side of the bed and rushing to the driver's side door. He threw it open to see Ruth rubbing her head, a small trickle of blood running down it. "Holy shit, are you all right?" Connor asked, concerned. "Yeah, just bonked my head pretty good," Ruth said with a pained smile. "And Brandy?" Connor asked. "I'm okay, but we have to move," Brandy said quickly. Connor looked back toward the farmhouse just as Stanton managed to get through the front door. However, the constant horn sound acted like a homing beacon to some of the zombies that were now sprinting in their direction. "We have to go," We have to go right now, Connor urged, pulling Ruth out from the truck as Brandy exited on the passenger side. He gave one more glance back into the truck, spotting Ruth's phone sitting in the seat, and grabbed it before joining the others. The three of them ran through the woods as hard as they could, the underbrush and lack of a clear trail slowing them down. Despite the obstacles, the sounds of thunderous footsteps and moaning coming from behind them pushed them forward. Connor brought up the rear of the group, just a few steps behind the women as they ran, since he had the only weapon. He glanced over his shoulder, spotting one creature that had broken away from the pack and was gaining on them. The other zombies were having trouble navigating through the dense wooded terrain, but this one had managed to follow the trail the group was cutting. Connor waited until the zombie was within a few yards of them, stopping on a dime and turning toward it. "Come on," he yelled. Connor psyched himself up before striking, swinging the bat across his body, catching the creature on the side of the arm and sending it off balance. The ghoul stumbled forward, falling face first onto the ground. Connor pounced, rushing toward the ghoul as it struggled to get back to its feet. He swung the bat wildly, striking it on the back. The impact was enough to send it down to the ground, allowing him to plant his foot at the small of its back. Connor quickly lined up a kill shot, connecting the barrel of the bat with the back of its head. A couple of swings later, and the creature fell lifeless. "Come on, Connor," Ruth called out from ahead, waving him forward. However, Connor stayed put. He looked back toward the other zombies that were still struggling with the underbrush, getting tripped up and slowed down but still managing to close the distance to 10 yards. Connor looked down at Ruth's phone, quickly navigating the screen to the alarm function. He set a timer for 90 seconds before throwing it as hard as he could toward the zombies that were trailing them. Connor turned back toward Ruth and Brandy, pumping his legs hard and catching up to them in a flash. He pushed them forward while keeping a running count in his head. After a 60-second count, he grabbed both of them, pulling the entire group behind a fallen tree and getting out of sight. "What are you doing?" Ruth whispered. Connor quickly put his finger to his mouth, signaling her to quiet down. Ruth nodded, and she and Brandy complied, trusting that he had a plan. They remained silent and out of sight, even as they heard moaning and footsteps coming from a few yards away. Before long, a loud ringing sound cut through the silence, agitating the nearby zombies and sending them running off in the opposite direction. The trio remained behind cover for a few moments before Connor popped his head up. "Okay, we're clear," he said. "What the hell was that?" Brandy asked. "Well, those things were drawn to the sound of the gunshots and the truck horn going off, so I figured they would go after the phone if I set the alarm on it," Connor explained. "Nicely played," Ruth said, impressed. "I'm just glad it worked," Connor said, relieved. "So, what do we do now?" Brandy asked. "I say we stay off the beaten path and start working our way south," Connor suggested. "Why south?" Brandy asked, confused. Connor smirked as he pointed back toward the farm. "Because I'm pretty sure that's north," he said. The two women cracked a smile before Ruth playfully smacked Connor on the shoulder. "Fair enough. But that doesn't answer my question," Brandy said. "What do we do now?" "We put some distance between us and those things, and hope that we can find some shelter before it gets too dark," Connor replied. Ruth's expression shifted from joyous to serious in an instant. "What is it, Ruth?" Connor asked, noticing her change in demeanor. "Do you still have your phone?" Ruth asked. Connor nodded as he reached into his bag, pulling out the satellite phone and handing it over. She opened up the GPS program, punching in a few things and scrolling along the map. "I think that's it," Ruth said, pointing at the screen. "What's it?" Brandy asked. Ruth turned the screen around to Connor, showing that a location marker had been set, although it was 15 miles southeast of them. "What am I looking at?" Connor asked. "My dad's old hunting shack," Ruth said. "I don't know why I didn't think of it before." "Probably because it's in the middle of nowhere, and I was pushing pretty hard to come up here," Connor said. "But it doesn't matter because you thought of it now." "Can we make it there by nightfall?" Brandy asked. "Unlikely, but it should keep us safe once we get there," Connor said. "With any luck, the moon will be out tonight, so we can keep going until we get there." We better get moving then, because I don't want to be out here in the dark any longer than we absolutely have to be. Chapter 8. Day 0 plus 2. 7:13 a.m. Connor gingerly stepped out of the small hunting shack into the cold as the sun began to emerge from behind the horizon. Both Ruth and Brandy were sleeping soundly inside, and he didn't want to wake them. He walked a few yards away from the front door, pulling out his satellite phone, which was down to only a few % power. With a defeated sigh, he clicked on Grant's number. The phone rang a few times before a weary voice picked up on the other end. Just like clockwork. If keeping accurate time meant anything anymore, that is, Grant said. "How are you hanging in there, buddy?" Connor asked. Grant let out a long, defeated sigh before responding. "Same as I was yesterday. Only down a bottle of bourbon," Grant replied. "Damn, Grant, you know you have to pace yourself," Connor said. "Don't worry, I am. There's still 4 bottles of stuff in the house, and if I did my math correctly, that should carry me until the end," Grant said. "Come on, man, don't talk like that. You can't give up hope," Connor urged. "I lost my hope yesterday. My will went away the day before that when the kids killed their mother, and before I had to." Grant trailed off, struggling to fight against his drunken emotions. Connor grimaced, knowing that he was the asshole for bringing that up. "I'm sorry, man, I really am. But I'm serious. You can't be giving up on me, because after today, I don't know when I'm going to be able to call again," Connor said. Grant let out a large laugh, confusing Connor. "What's so funny?" Connor asked. "This might be the last time we ever get to talk, and I finally get to say I told you so," Grant replied. "What are you talking about?" Connor asked, bewildered. "I told you when you bought that phone that you should go ahead and get the extra battery since you could write it off. But you said you didn't need one because you weren't ever going to go longer than 48 hours without power. Now here we are, going into day 3, and you're out of juice. So there you go, I told you so," Grant said with a smirk. Connor broke into laughter, fighting against his own emotions as well. "And all it took was the end of the world for you to be right," Connor said. "Hey, I'll take it. Because I'm pretty sure it really is the end of it all," Grant replied. "Is it that bad down there?" Connor asked. "I'm 5 miles from downtown Charlotte, and there are so many of those things outside I can't even see the road. There's no news, no help, no nothing," Grant explained. "I'm sorry, Grant, I really am," Connor said, his voice filled with sympathy. "It is what it is, man," Grant replied. Connor pulled the phone away from his head when a loud beep pierced through the receiver. In the middle of the screen, the no battery symbol flashed brightly. "I think my phone's about to go out, Grant. I just want to say that it's been a pleasure all these years." "You stay safe out there," Connor said. "I'm at the last place I'm ever going to be. I want you to stay safe out there. And I want you to do one more thing for me." Grant's voice trailed off as if he had forgotten something. Connor closed his eyes tightly, knowing that the phone clicked off and that Grant was likely too drunk to realize. He stood there for a moment, imagining what his longtime friend would ask him. "You got it, Grant, I'll be sure to do that," Connor muttered under his breath. Connor let out a sigh, lowering the phone and sliding it into his back pocket. He continued to stand there, staring at the sunrise, trying to get his mind off the moment. "Connor," Ruth's voice called from behind him. He turned to see Ruth stepping out of the small shack, carrying the radio in her hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you up," Connor said. "You didn't. This did," Ruth replied, handing the radio over to him. Connor gave her a confused look. "Just talk into it," Ruth said, nodding toward the device. Connor shrugged as he raised the device to his mouth, clicking it on and speaking. "Hello, this is Connor. Who is this?" "Well, hey there, Connor. My name's Gabe. It's good to hear someone's voice," a voice responded from the other end. "Likewise. I'm guessing that you're near Boone?" Connor asked. "I am. Some friends and I are holed up at an Old West theme park just outside of town," Gabe explained. "That sounds like quite the place to ride out the apocalypse," Connor remarked. For the most part, it is, although there's something nightmarish about getting stuck at your work during the end of it all, Gabe said with a laugh. Connor let out a laugh, nodding along. Hard to argue with that, Connor said. So where are you two at? Gabe asked. As best I can tell, we're a few miles west of Boone, taking refuge in a hunting shack, Connor replied. Have you heard anything about what's going on? The news has been off, and to be honest, you're the first person I've talked to outside these walls since all this started, Gabe asked. Connor contemplated for a moment, trying to find the right words before responding. I don't know a lot, only that it's bad. I just talked to a friend of mine in Charlotte, and it's completely overrun. It doesn't look like anyone's going to be coming to help us, Connor said. Gabe went silent for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. That is unfortunate, Gabe finally said. With that news in mind, Ruth's voice broke through. I don't suppose you might have room for a couple of newcomers, do you? Ruth asked, her tone hopeful, even though she knew the likely answer. Gabe hesitated, hemming and hawing before finally speaking. I would say yes, but there's about 1,000 of those things pressed up against our front gate. So even if you did get here, we wouldn't have a way to get you in, Gabe explained. Ruth rolled her eyes at the obvious lie Gabe had just told. Connor reached over and grabbed her hand to comfort her. It's all good, man, we understand, Connor said. Hey look, I'd love for you too. Gabe started, but Connor cut him off. I said it's all good, man. There's enough going on that you don't have to waste energy with more reasons, Connor said firmly, though his tone remained polite. Gabe piped down, realizing that he was coming off as a selfish asshole. For what it's worth, you might want to try the town of Blowing Rock. It's about half a day's hike south of here, but it's smaller and off the beaten path. I know a few boys that live down there, and they're trigger happy. So if anybody is riding this out, they are. They might be able to give you some shelter, Gabe suggested. I appreciate the suggestion, Gabe. We're going to get packed up and head that way now, Connor said. Good luck to you. Stay safe, Gabe replied. Yeah, you too, Gabe, Connor said before clicking off the radio and securing it to his belt. Well, he's a lying sack of shit, Connor muttered under his breath. Yeah, but he might be right about Blowing Rock, Ruth said. Can we make it there on foot? Connor asked. I'm pretty sure there's a trail that'll take us close enough for a look, Ruth replied. Well, let's grab Brandy and get going, Connor said. About her, Ruth trailed off, unsure of how to deliver the news. Connor, however, caught on. The infection got worse overnight, didn't it? Connor asked, his voice soft. Yeah, I don't think she's going to make it, Ruth said. Ruth began to get emotional, prompting Connor to pull her in close. They held the embrace for a few moments before turning and moving back toward the shack. As they entered, they heard Brandy coughing in the bed at the back. The two of them rushed to her side, Ruth grabbing a bottle of water to give her. Once they managed to get her coughing under control, she laid back down, letting out a pained grunt. I thought you two would have left by now, Brandy said weakly. We're not going to leave you, honey, Ruth said, her voice gentle. You really should. We all know what's happening to me, Brandy replied, her eyes filled with pain. Even if it is, we're not going to leave you alone, Ruth said. But I want you to, Brandy insisted. Brandy, Ruth said softly. I'm serious, Ruth. I'm so weak, I don't know how much longer I have, but I know it's not more than a day. You've been so kind to me, and it would bring me some sense of happiness to know you two are on your way to someplace safe. So please just pack up and go, Brandy pleaded. Connor reached down and gently pulled Ruth up from the bed, getting close to her ear and whispering. There's nothing we can do for her, Ruth, Connor said quietly. I know, but it just feels wrong to leave her like this, Ruth replied, her voice breaking. You know I can hear you, right? Brandy said, her voice feeble but sharp. Then you know how I feel, Brandy, Ruth said. Please, all I want to do is sleep and get some peace before I turn into one of those things. Go take care of yourselves. Just make sure that door is locked so I don't get out and hurt anybody, Brandy said, her eyes beginning to glaze over. Ruth reached down and grabbed Brandy's hand, giving it a tight squeeze, but only receiving a limp handhold in response. She patted the dying woman on the leg as she got up, walking to the other side of the shack. Connor took a knee beside Brandy, speaking low so that only she could hear it. "If you want me to, I can end it all for you," Connor offered. "I really appreciate the offer, Connor, but I wouldn't put that sort of evil on you. Besides, I paid for this ride, so I'm going to get every last second out of it," Brandy replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. Connor cracked a smile as he squeezed Brandy's hand. He stepped away from the bed, walking over to Ruth, who was grabbing the gear that they had scrounged together from the shack. "I think we should go," Connor said. I know, Ruth said. Ruth leaned over and put her head into Connor's chest, receiving a hug in return. They stood there for a moment, dealing with their feelings before snapping back into the moment. "Okay, let's get going," Connor said. Ruth exited the hunting shack, leaving Connor alone to look back at Brandy one last time. She gave him a half-hearted thumbs up before passing out on the bed. Connor stepped outside, securing the door so that Brandy couldn't get out once she reanimated. Both of them struggled to get their heavy backpacks on, the food and water weighing them down. "Okay, I'm following your lead since you know the area. The phone is dead, so we don't have GPS anymore," Connor said. "It shouldn't be a big deal as long as we know where south is," Ruth replied. The two of them began walking along the small trail leading away from the shack. Over the next 6 hours, they hiked through the wilderness, encountering nobody living or undead. As the last bits of energy were draining from their bodies, they spotted a clearing off to the side of the trail, which looked out of place. "That's odd. Somebody cut down a bunch of trees on the embankment," Connor said. "It might be an overlook to Blowing Rock. A nice spot for hikers to get up to," Ruth said. "Or for a photographer to get a nice shot of the skyline," Connor said with a dry chuckle. "Clearly you've never been to Blowing Rock, because I don't think there's much of a skyline, unless you count a row of 2-story buildings," Ruth said, a grin tugging at her lips. "Considering where we spent the last couple of nights, 2-story buildings sound like a metropolis," Connor replied with a wry smile. Connor reached over, grabbing Ruth's hand as they walked the last few yards to the clearing. They turned to take in the sight of the town, only to stare at it in disbelief. Most of the buildings on the north side of town had been reduced to ash, some of them still smoldering as the collection of 2-story buildings in the center of town burned unabated. They continued staring, soaking it all in. "Well, I don't think that's going to work for us," Connor said. "So what do you want to do?" Ruth asked. "I assume that there are more small towns like this around here?" Connor asked. "It might be another 10 miles to the next one," Ruth replied. "I'm game if you are," Connor said, shrugging. Ruth pulled Connor's hand up, giving it a light kiss before cracking a smile. "I used to wish for someone to go on romantic hikes with. Looks like I finally got it," Ruth said. Connor let out a smile, returning the hand kiss as the two of them continued walking down the trail. They didn't know where they were going or what awaited them around the next bend, only that they were going to face it together. The end.